I love this. His first explicit mention of her is referring to her as a dangerous, prehistoric beast. Ah, marriage, right? Okay. Let's see. How do people begin these things? I'm Seth. You may already know me as Waste Mailing List on Instagram, and now Twitter, and YouTube apparently. If you've been following me on any of those platforms, you're probably aware by now that this is not really my thing. I've never been into the whole talking at the camera deal. I've generally left that to the more outgoing booktubers among us. But in saying that, I also feel like I've been a little limited with what I can do with the platforms I've already been using. I love Instagram. I love the Bookstagram community that I've met on there. But I'm also hamstrung by the form. When I'm hit with a 2200 character count each time I'm trying to post something, I can't quite get to the granular level of detail that I'd be interested in doing so. So, this felt like the next logical step. I don't have much in the way of production value yet. Keen-eyed viewers will probably realize at this point that I'm shooting on an iPhone. It's early days. I'm just toying around with forms, seeing what works, what doesn't. We'll see how it all goes. How's that? Enough preamble. Let's get to what brings me here today. The Melancholy of Resistance by László Krasznahorkai. I was about halfway through this book when I realized that an Instagram post or even a long-form Goodreads review were not going to be enough for me to get into the level of detail that I want to discuss this. So, here we are. I'm late to Krasznahorkai myself, who's been around since the mid-80s. I came to his work via Chris Via over on Leaf by Leaf when he did a joint video about Satantango, Krasznahorkai's debut novel, and the associated Bellatar adaptation. Just a quick plug here, if you're not already watching Chris's videos, shame on you. What are you doing with your time? That guy is putting out some of the best content out there. I highly encourage you to check him out. This is Krasznahorkai's second novel, first printed in 1989 by the Hungarian publishing house MAGVETtomn. Hungarian viewers, if you're watching this, please raid the comments section with whatever pronunciation corrections you have. I guarantee I'll be needing them. Hotly anticipated after the blazing success of Satantango, this garnered immediate acclaim in the Eastern European literary community, but it was mostly unread by English-speaking audiences until about 11 years later. Enter George Szirtes. Dr. Szirtes is a Hungarian-born, English-based poet who reacquired the Hungarian language as an adult. He came to Krasznahorkai's attention by way of his poetry, something that I haven't yet read myself but I've been very interested in trying out. After the success in his native language under MAGVETtomn, Krasznahorkai and his editor were bouncing around names as to who could handle the no small task of translating his works into English. Adamant in his belief that prosaic and poetic sensibilities were more important than translation experience, Krasznahorkai suggested Szirtes as a possible name to handle the translation. Szirtes was initially resistant. He actually responded to Laszlo's first offer by saying, "Thanks, but I'm a poet, not a translator." After a little bit of a poking and prodding, they managed to get Szirtes to take on the job, and he actually started with the second novel, Melancholy. It took him 8 years to translate this, and it shows on every single page. In a good way. Even in translation, the language is stunning. After the profound success of Melancholy under new directions, there was no question as to who was going to handle Satantango. George Szirtes remained Krasznahorkai's primary translator for his first 3 novels and then handed it over to Ottilie Molzet, who took over Baron Venkheim's Homecoming. He's had a number of different translators since then. The reason I've devoted so much time to the backstory of just the translation here, aside from the fact that it's often a thankless job, is for the same reason that Krasznahorkai wanted Szirtes in the first place. His prosaic and poetic voice are absolutely integral to the success of this novel. That's on top of the innate challenge of trying to translate Hungarian, a notoriously difficult language I've heard, as well as the dense, demanding structure of Krasznahorkai's prose. I'll be getting to that in a bit. As far as I'm concerned, we have Szirtes as much to thank for translating it as Krasznahorkai for writing it. I read the New Directions edition of this novel, which was published in the year 2000. The cover art here is the 1889 painting by James Ensor, Christ's Entry into Brussels. I want you to put that on the back burner for a couple of minutes here, because we are going to be getting back to that. Following Satantango, this is the second of 4 constituent parts which have collectively been referred to as the author's Uber novel. An apocalyptic quartet delineated into 4 separate but interconnected novels. Satantango, The Melancholy of Resistance, War and War, and Baron Vankheim's Homecoming. While I would like to discuss the quartet in its entirety down the track, I'm going to limit the scope of my discussion today to just The Melancholy of Resistance. It opens with a simple epigraph. It passes, but it does not pass away. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this video. The novel is split into 3 acts. Part 1 is titled An Emergency, goes for about 60 pages. Part 2 comprises the bulk of the novel, the Werckmeister Harmonies. That goes for about 220 pages. And then the final act is a short 30-page little spree, simply titled Sermo super Sepulcrum. And we'll be getting to that as well. There's a blind spot I want to address right from the jump, the Bellatar adaptation. At the time of this recording, I have not had a chance to see it yet. I really wanted to get this video out while I still had the novel at front of mind after having recently finished it. And just with everything that's going on in my personal life and work right now, I didn't have time to get around to viewing it and feel like I could critically evaluate it enough to make it worthwhile. So for anyone expecting that, I apologize. If this does have some degree of success, I would like to do a comparative viewing video or something to that effect down the track. I'll figure it out when we get there. Let me give you an idea of the plot in the broadest strokes possible. This is the story of a backwater Hungarian town that welcomes the arrival of a demented circus, the main attraction of which is this: the stuffed carcass of the allegedly world's largest whale. That's it. Under the hypnotic influence of the circus and its strange orchestrator, simply named the Prince, this community falls into societal unrest, chaotic destruction, and the eventual rebirth of the town. Thanks to writers like Siebold and Sontag, the word apocalyptic has been inexorably associated with Krasznahorkai's work. I think that's as good a place as any to start. Depending on where you lie on the theological or conspiratorial spectrum, the word apocalypse probably draws to mind some specific images. Floods, locusts, plagues, disease, meteor impacts, the sky darkening as the sun burns out. You won't find any of that here. Krasznahorkai's imagery is much more, shall we say, abstract. One's daily habits were disrupted by a sense of ever-spreading, all-consuming chaos which rendered the future unpredictable, the past unrecallable, and ordinary life so haphazard that people simply assumed that whatever could be imagined might come to pass. That if there were only one door in a building, it would no longer open. That wheat would grow head downward into the earth, not out of it. And that, since one could only note the symptoms of disintegration, the reasons for it remained unfathomable and inconceivable. I mean, seriously, that's the first fucking page. Who writes like this? I don't know anyone except maybe Pynchon or Gaddis who can launch instantaneously into high-concept themes like this without it feeling forced or, God forbid, metafictional. Krasznahorkai's apocalypse isn't the cliched fire and brimstone type we've all become acquainted with through pop culture. His breakdown is one of relentless, unrestrained decay. Readers of Satantango will find this very familiar. The irreversible process of ruin, schism, and disintegration would continue according to its own infrangible rules, and that, day by day, the range of whatever things were still capable of functioning or showing vigor was growing narrower. The way she saw it, the very houses were dying by imperceptible degrees of neglect, obedient to the fate that was certain to overtake them. The bond between lodger and lodging was broken. Stucco was dropping in great chunks. Rotten window frames had separated from the walls, and, on either side of the street, roof after roof showed signs of sagging, as if deliberately to demonstrate that something in the constitution of beams and rafters, and not just beams and rafters, but stones, bones, and earth itself, was in the process of losing cohesion. Everything in this town is rotting. Stucco is crumbling from the walls. Weeds are overtaking yards. The pavement is cracked to shit. Trash has literally frozen to the concrete in waves. A literal ocean of garbage. The town is literally and metaphorically breaking down to pieces, which is described in obsessive, lucid detail. My reading of this is that this aesthetic of decay, if you might call it, is the literal embodiment of the amoral condition that has taken over this community. With Krasznahorkai, his imagery isn't simply delivered as an aesthetic pleasure, but also as a thematic device. You could read it any number of ways, but I see it as relating to the people who inhabit this town. They all range from apathetic to nihilist to downright fascist, all exhibiting some form of moral deterioration. The dysfunctional relationships between these people is much of where the substance of the novel is found. This brings me to the characters in the novel. There are three that drive the narrative. Tunde Esther, her husband, Georgi Esther, and his best and only friend, Janos Volushka. Tunde, the neighborhood busybody, is disgusted by the deterioration of her town and has a new social movement plan to deal with it. She's given it the tagline, "A tidy yard, an orderly house." Her plan is to drive her peers into cleaning up the town into the pristine bourgeoisie community she's always imagined. The barrier to entry is that nobody gives a shit. The townsfolk are more than happy to remain wallowing in their own filth, drinking themselves into mind-numbing oblivion. Mrs. Esther saw straight to the heart of their opposition, understanding that their impotence and craven civility sprang from an unreasonable, though to them justified, fear of all enterprise that was aimed at general renewal. A renewal which, to them, might look like general decay. For in all passionate espousals of the new, people were liable to detect traces of an equally passionate drift toward chaos, and, quite rightly, suspect that the powers unleashed, instead of protecting that which was irreversibly dead and buried, would smash it to pieces in the good cause of replacing the featureless boredom of their selfish lives with the elevating passion of communal action. And this is exactly what she plans to do. She is fully prepared to burn it all down, rid the town of all these vagrants, vagabonds, and drunks, and build her Orwellian utopia on the ashes. And she knows exactly how to do it. Firstly, she invites the traveling circus to her town in order to instigate everyone into action. See, there's rumors floating around that societal unrest tends to follow this circus wherever it goes, and that could instigate the exact smashing to pieces that she's looking for. She capitalizes on these rumors and weaponizes their paranoia against them. Everyone he met was preoccupied by the notion of the collapse into anarchy, a state that, in the general opinion, was no longer avoidable. Everyone was talking about the unstoppable stampede into chaos, the unpredictability of daily life, and the approaching catastrophe, without a clear notion of the full weight of these frightening words. Since, he surmised, this epidemic of fear was not born out of some genuine, daily increasing certainty of disaster, but out of an infection of the imagination whose susceptibility to its own terrors might eventually lead to actual catastrophe. There's no actual approaching apocalypse, only the constant fear and paranoia of one. She can use this circus to precipitate anarchy, blame it on the traveling attraction, and then take credit when she gets it all under control. False flag. Classy. Her second main action is the indirect recruitment of her husband to instigate all these people into action. See, despite the fact that people have no interest in taking part in her plan, her husband is something of a local celebrity and has some clout that she can actually use to get them all to dance to her tune. Now, I do say she recruits him indirectly because he openly and vocally hates her. I love this. His first explicit mention of her is referring to her as a dangerous, prehistoric beast. Marriage, right? Suffice it to say, she'll need to go through an intermediary if she wants him on board. Georgi Esther, the retired director of the local Academy of Music, is a disillusioned misanthrope confined to his home study. He too is patently aware of the level of degeneration going on in the town, but he's taken a much more hands-off approach to the whole situation. The undeniable fact was that nature herself had laid down her tools and finished her regular task, and the once brotherly bond between heaven and earth was well and truly broken, and that the last act had assuredly begun, wherein we were orbiting alone among the scattered detritus of our laws, and would soon be left staring, as fate had decreed, idiotically, uncomprehendingly, watching and shivering as the light steadily withdrew from us. Believe it or not, he takes it a step further. People are talking about apocalypse and the Last Judgment, because they do not know that there will be neither apocalypse nor Last Judgment. Such things would serve no purpose, since the world will quite happily fall apart by itself and go to rack and ruin, so that everything may begin again, and so proceed ad infinitum. And this is as perfectly clear. So that everything may begin again. Keep it in mind. He wasn't always like this, though. Georgi had one passion in life: music. Ever since he was young, he had lived with the unshakable conviction that music, which for him consisted of the omnipotent magic of harmony and echo, provided humanity's only sure stay against the filth and squalor of the surrounding world, music being as close an approximation to perfection as can be imagined. These people live an incredibly bleak existence, and all have their own personal form of escapism. For Mrs. Plouffe, the woman with whom the novel opens, it's preserving fruits. For Janos, her son, it's stargazing. And for Georgi, it's music. He had previously devoted the entirety of his career to the pursuit of pure pitch. In his studies, he came across the work of the composer Andreas Werckmeister, who proposed a novel 12 halftone musical register from which all instruments could be precisely tuned. Esther spent years studying these Werckmeister harmonies, each vibration of which he believed consisted of an endlessly deep series of harmonics and frequencies which translated to pure aesthetic pleasure. He had found what he'd believed as pure pitch, the perfection he strives for. And this is what he became famous in the community for, blessing their dull, bleak lives with gorgeous music. There is a catch, though. Years into his study of the Werckmeister harmonic scale and the entire Western musical canon upon which it was based, he discovered that these were not in fact true tones, but were based off of incorrect calculations. To add insult to injuries, none of his colleagues seemed to give a shit. They all just continued to compose off of the Werckmeister harmonic scale. Esther became deeply disillusioned with the entire academic enterprise, resigned in a fury, and retreated to his study at home, where he spent the majority of his days regaling his only friend Volushka with these nihilistic, misanthropan philippics. And here is the intermediary that Tunde plans to use to get Georgi on board with her plan. She knows that Janos Volushka is his only friend, and she bullies him into convincing to get Georgi on board. She needs her husband's clout to influence the townspeople into taking these actions that she wants. Her social renewal is going exactly the way she plans. A tidy house, an orderly yard. Or tidy yard, orderly house. Whatever. Volushka's cut from another cloth entirely. We first meet him surrounded by drunks in a bar, performing sort of a part lecture, part interpretive dance of astronomical movements. And he's using all the different people in the bar as, planets and moons and stars. It's really quite a strangely comic sequence in a very, very dark book. Volushka is deeply fascinated by cosmological mechanisms and is absolutely, religiously certain that some sort of grand narrative or overarching designs governs his and everyone else's actions and destiny. Despite vain efforts to understand and experience what precisely his dear friends wanted from each other, he confronted the slow tide of human affairs with a sad incomprehension, dispassionately, and without any sense of personal involvement. For the greater part of his consciousness, the part entirely given over to wonder, had left no room for more mundane matters, and had ever since trapped him in a bubble of time, in one eternal, impenetrable, and transparent moment. He walked, blindly and tirelessly, with the incurable beauty of his personal cosmos in his soul. For decades now, he stared at the same sky above him and trod much of the same route of concrete and weeds beneath. And if his life had anything that might be called a history at all, it consisted of those 35 years of ever-deepening orbits. Gorgeous. Just sublime. It was right here that I noticed a sort of tonal shift from Satantango to Melancholy for something more solipsistic. Volusia's got this longing, this yearning for something greater. And I think one of the biggest differences I saw between this and the previous novel was the fact that an actual, genuine friendship exists at the center of it. In Satantango, everyone was at each other's throats. But here there's something genuine going on. Not without its faults, mind you. There's a real push and pull between the cynical nihilist Esther and the faithful idealist Volusia throughout the novel. The circus brings about the anarchy to which Volusia and Georgi are both complicit. As they become entangled in the town's destruction, Volusia sinks into his own misanthropy and nihilism, whereas Georgi actually regains a sense of higher purpose and meaning in his life. It's this dark comedic irony. It's quite tragic, but also quite hilarious to see where they both end up in the end. You may notice that I'm dancing around the main action of the novel, the societal breakdown and rioting that takes place over a single intense night. And that's because I don't think that's a sequence that can be described and still convey its full impact. It's really something that just needs to be experienced firsthand, particularly the existential horror that Volusia experiences as he takes part in the rioting and becomes part of this frenzied mob. That being said, I do think it's valuable to get into why the collapse occurs. Midway through the bacchanalian frenzy, Volusia comes across this authorless notebook, which, at its most base level, describes the events of the evening, but it also digs immediately to the heart of why this is happening in the first place. But nothing could assuage the unconscious fury of our new and tragic understanding, our sense of having been cheated, our fear, for however we looked for it, we could not find a fit object for our disgust and despair, and so we attacked everything in our way with an equal and infinite passion. There was nothing left to lose. Everything had become intolerable, unbearable, beyond the pale. Each house, each fence, each advertising pillar, telegraph post, shop, or the post office, even the lightly drifting odors of the bakery had become intolerable. Intolerable to every precept of law and order, every petty, demanding obligation, the continuous and hopeless expenditure of energy in the attempt to suggest that there might be some point to all of this, rather than be faced by the unyielding, indifferent, universal incomprehensibility of things. No amount of screaming would have helped us find a chink in the enormous armor of silence that slowly descended on us. So we proceeded without a word, hearing only the scrape and rumble of our own progress over the crisp and brilliant sharp frost. Look, there's a lot of places you could go with that right there. Krasznahorkai has said himself that he doesn't write with a political motivation, but it's very hard to read something like that and not pick up at least traces of an underlying ideological agenda. Now, I'm not a historian, but I'm very good with Wikipedia. In the late 80s, when this book was written, Hungary was on the precipice of a significant sociological shift. History-averse viewers, stay with me. The Soviet economy had reached a wholesale collapse, and the resultant debt and unemployment rates in Hungary had absolutely skyrocketed. That, combined with the repressed historical trauma of Hungary's complicity in the Holocaust, all this would feed nicely into a powder cake of societal upheaval. Thomas Hobbes proposed the idea of the state of nature in the 1600s with his book Leviathan. The default state of human behavior is that every single person is out only for themselves and has license to anything their heart could desire. Without a strong central authority, a Mrs. Esther perhaps, mass violence would break out as each and every individual attempt to take what's theirs. Bellum, Omnium, Contra, Omnes, the war of all against all. In spite of an individual's desire to take what they feel is rightfully theirs, the theory posits that without a strong central authority, a governmental body, that individual would completely lack the faculties to take the action necessary, and the result would just be senseless, chaotic violence. Part 2 of this book, in a nutshell. Imagine a deeply impoverished Hungarian town with no clear central authority, no chance of social mobility, no chance of escape. That, in combination with the generational guilt that's inherited from the country's past, you've got this beautiful confluence of events that would probably lead to some sort of violent uprising. All you would need is something or someone to light the fuse, so to speak. The Prince and the Whale catalyze this uprising and give Mrs. Esther her opportunity to step in, insert herself as that authority, and quell the violence, rebuilding her utopia from the ground up. But does it work out the way she had planned? Stay with me. Let's talk about the formal conceit that I've found divides the crowd. The long, unbroken, chapter-length paragraphs. This is classic Krasznahorkai for you. If you've read Siebold or Bernhard or even at times Wallace and Bolaño, you'll probably recognize this formal tick. Anecdotally, I found it really divides the crowd. It draws some people in and it is an immediate put-off for others. Regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, there is a lot of contention over its functional purpose. It's a real chicken and egg scenario, right? Does the structure dictate the story or the story dictate the structure? Surtees refers to it as a slow lava flow of narrative, a vast black river of type. Yeah, that checks out. My mate Nick over at 11th Volume sent me a Guardian article by Emmett Stinson, where Gerald Murnane, an Australian author, goes on record to say, "I expound my love for long sentences and disapprove when they violate traditional rules of syntax." He criticizes several well-known authors, including Thomas Pynchon, Herman Broch, and László Krasznahorkai, for writing the wrong kind of long sentences. Shots fired! The wrong kind of long sentences, eh, Gerald? All right, fair enough. Let me introduce you to James Wood. This is from his 2011 New Yorker article where he discusses the body of Krasznahorkai's work. Augmentation in the avant-garde novel often looks like a kind of subtraction. Augmentation takes the form of an intensification of the sentence rather than an intensification of the things that many people habitually associate with the novel: plot, characters, objects. A lot has already disappeared from this fictional world, and the writer concentrates on filling the sentence, using it to notate and reproduce the tiniest qualifications, hesitations, intermittences, affirmations, and negations of being alive. This is one reason that very long, breathing, unstoppable sentences, at once literary and vocal, have been almost inseparable from the progress of experimental fiction since the 1950s. Claude Simon, Thomas Bernhard, Jose Saramago, W.G. Siebold, Roberto Bolaño, David Foster Wallace, James Kelman, and now László Krasznahorkai have used the long sentence to do many things, but all of them have been at odds with a merely grammatical realism, whereby the real is made to fall into approved units and packets. In fact, these writers could be called realist of a kind, but the reality that many are interested in is reality examined to the point of madness. Hope the sound of that mic dropping didn't hurt your delicate ears, Gerald. All jokes aside, Woods perfectly captures the utility of Krasznahorkai's serpentine, long, seemingly endless sentences. This intensification of the sentence isn't just an aesthetic preference, but also adds to the atmosphere of madness throughout the novel. He takes a moment, a statement, an observation, stretches it far out beyond the threshold of having made his point, sometimes for pages at a time, until your eyes start to blur, your ears ring, and you can't remember what the fuck you were reading. The result is an anxious, slowly building dread that is incredibly difficult to put your finger on. Lovecraftian, in the truest sense of the word. It actually reminds me a lot of what Dr. B, the narrator from Stefan Zweig's chess story, went through. When subject to complete, unbroken isolation, that narrator had one outlet for all of his energy and boredom, and so he poured himself into it, driving himself insane with the level of detail that he studies in this book. It's a bit like that when you're reading Krasznahorkai. On literary merit alone, I find it stunning. I would read Krasznahorkai's shopping list if New Directions published it. You should consider that. The Whale. That's a tough one to dissect, because there's a number of different ways you could read it. There's a strong case for it to be made as a Hobbesian authoritarian body, a symbol of repression. The ghosts of Hungary's communist history are undoubtedly present here. But that argument has already been made by people a lot smarter than me. For an excellent take on that particular perspective, look up John Hodgkin's 2009 essay, Not Fade Away. I'll link to it below. My reading of The Whale feeds back into how I read Satantango, as an external locus of control. The people of this town have all the tools and resources necessary to rise themselves up out of poverty, but they choose to wallow in their own self-imposed Kafkaesque misery. It's only when the prince, the puppeteer behind this circus, rolls into town, his Leviathan in tow, that the people are instigated into actually taking some sort of autonomous action, albeit to a destructive end. Krasznahorkai has said himself that he's a long-standing reader of Kafka, and it absolutely shows here. The idea of cages of our own design is a thematic through line that I drew from one book to the next. The Whale and the Prince are really just the next logical extension of what Eremias represented in Satantango. A leader, an icon, a figure that could pull these people out of their misery. Learned helplessness. It's fucking infuriating. Thought-provoking though. From an aesthetic standpoint alone, the imagery of this whale carcass with its jaws hinged open so wide that you can see down its seemingly endless gullet is just haunting. That picture lives rent-free in my brain forever. Thanks, Laszlo. Let's talk about the cover art briefly. As I previously mentioned, this is a painting by James Ensor from 1889 called Christ's Entry into Brussels. In an effort to try and tie it into the novel and figure out why it was used as the cover here, I looked up a bit of information on the J. Paul Getty Museum website, and they had this listed underneath it. Ensor's society is a mob, threatening to trample the viewer, a crude, ugly, chaotic, dehumanized sea of masks, frauds, clowns, and caricatures. Public, historical, and allegorical figures, along with the artist's family and friends, make up the crowd. The haloed Christ at the center of the turbulence is in part a self-portrait, mostly ignored, a precarious, isolated visionary amidst the herd-like masses of modern society. Ensor's Christ functions as a political spokesperson for the poor and oppressed, a humble leader of the true religion. The prince and his whale, this Leviathan returned, rouses the anarchic spirit in this community and instigates them into taking part in their own self-imposed apocalypse. The wicked irony of it all is that there is no incoming apocalypse. All the destruction that takes place is entirely the result of their own imagined demons. Krasznahorkai uses this spirit to paint a portrait of inevitability. Physical and social deterioration and breakdown are coming, whether we choose to take part and accelerate it or let it happen on its own accord. Again, let me quote Georgi ranting at Volushka in his study. People are talking about the apocalypse and the Last Judgment because they do not know that there will be neither apocalypse nor Last Judgment. Such things would serve no purpose since the world will quite happily fall apart by itself and go to rack and ruin so that everything may begin again. I think we're getting closer to what this is all about. Krasznahorkai's novels offer incredible latitude for interpretation, and that can both work for and against me here. When trying to get into the nuts and bolts of what the grander meaning is behind books like this, I'm really venturing into personal interpretation. So, grains of salt, keep all that in mind as we get into what I'm gonna discuss next. There are any number of different ways you could read this book. This is mine. When trying to tease out the themes of Melancholy, I always come back to two things: music and decay, both of which act analogously to one another. Georgi has spent his entire life torturing himself over the pursuit of pure tones, perfect pitch. His instrument, a beautiful Steinway piano, is constantly undergoing what he refers to as musical resistance, or the tendency of the strings to warp out of tune with time. This in itself is a form of decay. You can always tune an instrument, any stringed instrument, piano, guitar, whatever, to near perfection, but with time it will inevitably slide out of tune, a resistance to perfection. There's no Maxwell's demon in Krasznahorkai's universe. Entropy will always be allowed to proceed to its logical conclusion, breakdown and chaos. He makes this explicitly clear in the final act of the novel. Now, quick disclaimer here, if you haven't read The Melancholy of Resistance, I would encourage you to jump forward one section here, just because I am going to be getting into the very last few pages of the book, and I would hate to spoil it for you. Although this isn't really the type of book that you can spoil. Sermo super Sepulcrum. In this sequence, we see Mrs. Esther relishing in the success of her plan, with her feet kicked up hideously on the table, munching away at these preserved cherries and rum. The story ends with her speaking at Mrs. Plouffe, Volushka's mother's funeral, as she died in the night of rioting. After a brief eulogy, the viewpoint literally zooms in microscopically into Mrs. Plouffe's corpse, and Krasznahorkai delivers this stunning, just wildly, unnecessarily, but so necessarily detailed description of the rot going on in her body. After a long and stiff resistance, the remaining tissue, cartilage, and finally bone gave up the hopeless struggle. Nothing remained, and yet not one atom had been lost. Everything was there. It is simply that there was no clerk capable of making an inventory of all the constituents. But the realm that existed once and only once, had disappeared forever, ground into infinitesimal pieces by the endless momentum of the chaos within the crystals of order that survived, the chaos that consisted of an indifferent and unstoppable traffic between things. It ground the empire into carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sulfur. It took its delicate fibers and unstitched them till they were dispersed and had ceased to exist, because they had been consumed by the force of some incomprehensibly distant edict, which must also consume this book, here, now, at the full stop, after the last word. It passes, but it does not pass away. It's Werner von Braun all over again. Matter cannot be destroyed, only transformed. The constituent elements of Mrs. Plouffe's body decompose into their base ingredients and are returned to cosmic matter, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. Volushka's belief in a grand narrative and design was correct, but he's looking in the wrong direction. He spent his entire life with his head up in the clouds when he should have been looking right here, in this town, around him. The inevitability of deterioration is the universality that connects every element of this novel. It's the force that inevitably pulls Georgi's piano out of tune. It's the breakdown of corpses into stardust. It's the rotting of houses no matter how many times you rub a feather duster over the mantelpiece. Tunde succeeds in creating her utopia, but she ultimately fails because it's going to cycle right back to the place it came from, the snake eating its own tail forever. Nothing remained, and yet not one atom had been lost. It passes, but it does not pass away. Krasznahorkai is a bit like Pynchon insofar as he's more than comfortable letting us flounder in uncertainty as to what the underlying meaning or the objective truth behind his work is. That is, if you even subscribe to the notion of objective truth. I say this as a caveat because, like I said before, everything here is really just conjecture and my own personal interpretation of what I've read. There's a quiet moment near the end of the novel where the rioting has died down and Mrs. Esther is taking her place as the head of the new social order, and Volushka is confined to a mental asylum, and Georgi's alone in his study again. And he does something that's very out of character for him. He sits down at his beautiful Steinway piano, pulls out his tuning key, tunes it to the Werckmeister harmonic register, and then starts to play Bach. Prelude in B major, not out of ideological purity, not for its academic quality, but purely for love for its beauty as an aesthetic object. That right there is the melancholy of resistance. It's an acceptance of the impossibility of perfection. That right there is the melancholy of resistance. It's an acceptance of the impossibility of perfection. In Krasznahorkai's ontology, everything. Political movements, carnival attractions, rioters taking part in senseless violence, even the brick and mortar of houses, exists on a spectrum of that which resists and that which opposes resistance. But no matter what action one takes, everything slides into deterioration eventually. You can fight it, you can resist it all you want, but entropy always wins. In saying this, the acceptance of deterioration doesn't rob an action or a piece of art of its value. Think Gautier, art for art's sake. Gheorghe doesn't sit down to play at that piano, to academically dissect it, or with some sort of political motivation. He does it because Prelude in B major is a beautiful piece of music. That's it. That's all there needs to be. Krasznahorkai understands this intrinsically. If he wrote purely with a political motivation, he wouldn't suffuse his prose with such poetry and rhythm. I believe he suffers from his own melancholy of resistance. The innate and ever-present impulse to take a moment and resist it, stretch it, wrestle with it, turn it into something that will last, and then resign yourself when you realize it's an impossibility. It's stuffing the body of a whale. It's preserving fruits to forestall the rot. It's trying to capture a perfect harmony. And above all, it's crafting exquisite, labyrinthian sentences that lift you out of your chair and take you somewhere else entirely, just like it did me. Against all opposition, time ticks onward, with or without your permission. Everything breaks down. This book will break down, but that doesn't make it pointless. It passes, but it doesn't pass away. That has been, in my mind, the grand mission of Krasznahorkai from the beginning. To take reality, the reality of a single moment, and examine it to the point of madness. Oh, okay. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you tagging along for my circuitous ramblings. All the resources I drew from, I'll put in the description box below. If you have an interest in Krasznahorkai, it's all well worth a look. If you have an alternate reading of the novel you'd like to share, please get in touch. I'd love to hear it. Send me a DM, leave a comment, do what you gotta do. As I said in the beginning, I'm very new to this, and I'm looking for whatever feedback you can offer. Please, be brutally honest. I promise, I can take it. We can still be friends. If you liked what you saw, you're on YouTube. You know where the subscribe button is by now. I don't have to tell you. Yeah, shit. Guess that's it. Exist on a spectrum of that which resists and that which fuck!